This is Ground Affected. Is that mic on? It's on. My name is your dad, and welcome to the second makeup brush you've stolen from your wife this week. A little while ago, I started painting and printing 3D models, and when I started, there was a Discord called STL Collectibles. It might not have gone by that name back then, but that is the name it is known by today. And I found on that Discord an STL that would only be made a year and a half later, even though I had printed it the day I got it. And that was a Jedi Honor. And even though this video is not going up on May the 4th, I did decide to paint her because of May the 4th. Because apparently it's some kind of nerd day of some sorts, something about a Star Horse, I'm not 100% sure, but I do know they have nice shiny little light torches and they have a little green frog that they run around with. And of course, if you're new around here, this channel shows you how I paint things. I also give you tips and tricks on 3D printing, and sometimes I might review a printer. And before we get on with this, make sure to give it a like, perhaps consider subscribing. I can guarantee you I'll earn that subscription by the end of this video, and if I don't, there is instructions for that right in the last few seconds of the video. Also, there is Patreon, link in the description, bruh. Now that we've got all of that out the way, let's get straight into painting this model. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to need to clean out all the parts and then give them a good solid primer. The primer is what's going to help the paint on top of it adhere to the model underneath. The primer that I use is Vallejo Surface Primer. I give them a solid base and I allow them to dry. Then starting with the skin tones, I'm going to start out with my same flesh set that I always use, the Fairy Flesh set, from Nocturna by Vallejo, or a mix of the two. I start out with not the darkest color, but the darkest pinkish color in the set, and I spray that as a solid base coat. Once that dries, it's never dark enough, so I have to come back and paint another layer over the top of that. Then I start off by layering colors, and I'm going to start layering base flesh, which is going to be a thinner coat than the previous base layer. And by thinner, what I mean is that I've thinned the paints down so that they're slightly translucent. This is because there is more water to paint ratio, giving me a ways to be able to layer the paints on top of each other and compound the colors as I build this layer up. I then move on to medium flesh, and I use the exact same procedures with a thinner layer of paint. I'm going to spray this mostly from the top. Then moving on to Fairy Flesh, this is going to be one of the highest highlights on the model, and I'm going to paint this in the exact same way as I did before. Now for the secret trick of Grimoire Purple. This is to bring out the reds and the saturation inside the skin tone, and this is going to be laid on in a super thin glaze. This is not the only step though. I'm going to add Demonic Yellow in the same fashion, but this time all over the model, not only from the bottom. This is to bring a little bit more warmth into the skin. On the body, I'm going to start out by painting Unforgiven Green as a base coat over all the green parts. I'm then going to let that dry, and I'm going to come back into that with Angel Green, and I'm going to spray that mostly from the top, or essentially mostly from where the highlights are, and I'm going to allow that to dry as well. Then using green skin, I'm going to spray from the top mostly because this is where the light comes from, and I'm going to allow that to create the highlights on top of the suit. Using contrast paint Sagor Brown, I'm going to spray paint a base coat over all the brown parts on the model. Then using chipping from Ammo by Mig, I'm going to come back in and I'm going to highlight some of those parts. This is not going to be the highest highlight though. I will come back to that. While that dried, I used liquid mask to mask off areas on the suit and body that I don't want to cover with the next layer of paint that I'm going to paint down. Liquid mask is not always the best option, but it is a fast option for someone like me who has experience using it. If it's your first time using it, don't expect this to be a fast option. You need to learn to use this stuff. Just practice on a couple of models first. I then use the Sagor Brown again, and I spray my base coat, the same thing with the chipping over the top for the highlights. I set that aside to dry, and I used Angel Green to paint down the first layers of paint on the base. Once that had dried, I came back with this burnt cadmium red from Vallejo, and I'm going to paint very carefully over the top layer on the detailing of the base. A good trick or tip for something like this is to make sure to use a broad brush and use the side of it only. This is going to help you keep that paint out the details. Using bronze from Pro Acryl, I'm going to paint the rim around the base, and this is going to give it that lovely shiny effect. I then went back in and peeled off all the Vallejo liquid mask off the model. This is something that can be a little bit messy and sometimes a little bit difficult too, but if you just take your time and use a couple of sharp objects, toothpicks, knives, whatever you can find, try not to scrape the paint underneath, but if you've prepared the model well, this shouldn't be a problem at all. Just take your time, make sure you get it out of all the gaps, and make sure there is nothing left on the model for the next section of paint. Now using red leather, I'm going to go in and paint the inside of the fringe that's got to be attached to her head. And while that dried, I went to do a couple of the trimming on the suit itself. Using Cygor Brown, I'm going to paint the straps that hang down the sides of her waist, and this is to try and create a little bit of contrast between the browns on the suit. At the same time as that, I painted the saber holders in the same brown. Using Reikland Flesh Shade, I went back into the suit again and I painted just the midsection. I don't know what this thing is called, but it's like a plate around the waist, and this needed a different color. I then base coated the hair, and I used red leather again to base coat this entire hair. And while I was there, I mixed a little bit of Cygor Brown into the red leather to create a darker color for the eyebrows. Carefully painting the eyebrows on, making sure the shapes were good. Using dark silver, I'm now going to start adding a couple of accent highlights to the metallic pieces across the suit of this body. That means buckles and the little straps that hold the belts on. I gave her earrings a painting of green just so that they stand out nicely, and I painted her lips. I used the same cadmium red that I used earlier, and I mixed a bit of white into that. Back onto some trimming again, and I painted the silver trims on the lightsaber holders. I painted her knee guards with Unforgiven green. This is so that they stand off the suit. I then took Nuln Oil and put it into the center of the emblem on her belt. Using Unforgiven green, I painted the straps across the boots, and I used dark silver on the buckles as well. I mixed natural flesh and red leather together to make a color for the top of the shoes. I then painted a light silver over the handles of the lightsabers, and went back with the dark silver over the armor that's on her hand guards. I took Nuln Oil, the gloss Nuln Oil, and I painted that over the handles of the lightsabers just to create a bit more depth and make them look a little bit dirty. I then went in to paint the flesh tones across the arms and hands. I started out in the same fashion that I painted this across her face, and I used the darker pinkish color, and then I started to work my way up by using fairy flesh and natural flesh. I use this paint really thin. This is something that helps you be able to build up so that you can go from a dark to a light and still have a gradient within that little section that you painted with the brush. I then glued on the arms. That one saber wasn't ready yet, so I had to wait for that to dry. I then needed to add some blush to her face. Because she's a cartoon character, she does have a little bit more blush on her face, and I used pink for this, super watered down, and I allowed that to dry and did 2 or 3 layers. Now for painting her eyes, I'm going to use an airbrush medium to thin down my black paint. This is going to make it easier to make it flow and fit into the corners and recesses nice and easily. Making sure that this shape is perfect, because this is a shape that sets up for the next section of painting on the eyes. Using highlight skin, which I've said before, it looks white but it's not white. I'm going to paint the shape of the whites of her eyes. Once that had dried, I added a little bit of blue and a little bit of grey and mixed that into the corner sections of her eyes, just to create a little bit more depth. I then used deep blue as the base for the irises of the eyes, and I painted perfect circles, at least as perfect as I could, making sure they don't look squint and wonky. Once that had dried, I took Psychic Shock and I painted that into the center of those irises. I did 2 layers of this because I wanted the color to be nice and bright and bold. Make sure to leave a little bit of the blue around the edge. This will create the illusion that the eye has that cool color shapes and things that eyeballs have. Now taking the same black, I'm going to paint the pupils of the eyes. Making sure that they're not too big, also not too small. You need to make sure they're in the center of the iris, and once they're dry, you come back with the white and highlight. I chose to highlight on the far left and the top right of this eye. And once that has all been done and it's dried, I take a glass clear coat and I paint her lips, the jewelry on her ears, and across her eyes to give them a little bit more wetness. Congratulations for making it this far into one of my videos. In a previous video I mentioned that I was going to give away a wet palette, and I've decided one of the commenters who I'm going to give that wet palette to, and that is Dromans007. Of course, I will reply to your comment letting you know that you have won the wet palette, and I'll need you to get in contact with me somehow. Perhaps you can email me. I will give you my email address in that reply. Also, don't forget, if you happen to pick up any tips in this video that you think someone else might do well with knowing, then the best thing you can do to help this channel is to share my videos with someone else. Perhaps consider your gran, and if your gran really enjoys it that much, she might consider subscribing to my Patreon, which helps the channel to keep these lights blinding my eyeballs. And speaking of Patreon, there's a couple new patrons I'd like to thank for joining in the last week. Ricky, Team Velocity, David Bond, Frypan _ and Joey Merwin. Thank you, my dudes, because without you guys, my eyeballs would not be stinging from the lights that are blinding them as I speak. And as the channel is growing, I'm really excited to see where we go to in the future. Of course, things are happening. It's really becoming difficult to keep up with everyone online. Also, don't forget, if you paint or print 3D objects and you would like me to share it on my Instagram, I will share stuff to my stories that has been hashtagged with ground affected. That is hashtagged and not tagged personally. If you tag me, unfortunately I don't see those because it gets lost in the sea of notifications, but I do go and check the hashtag daily. Of course, don't forget to leave a like. Leave some words in the little space below that YouTube gives you to leave some words in. And if you haven't already, click the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos. And of course, if you happen to make it this far in one of my videos, and you didn't like anything that you saw or heard, there's only one thing that I can say to you. Can you just please click dislike and bruh? I wonder if that messed with them climbing on the chair at the end of the video instead of the beginning of the video this time. Also, I was wearing pants.